Okay, folks, I wanted to go over something that's been bugging me for a while. And it's something that Scott Adams has brought up on repeated occasions. And it's one of those things where I don't want to agree with him, but I kind of have to because when you get right down to it, he's right. And it's about talking about science. When you're talking about science, it turns out that you can never really have certainty about what you're hearing because unless you are an actual scientist and unless you are a scientist in the field that you're working with, or that you're having to deal with from the articles that you're reading, you're never actually going to do the science yourself. You're never actually going to do any research or any experimentation or any. You're just basically going to read a paper that somebody else has written. Maybe not even the paper itself. Maybe you're just going to read a summary of the paper that has been distilled through for you either through another scientist who is interpreting the paper or perhaps through a media person who is a science writer. And so you can't really know with certainty that what you're being told is true. And it's very, very aggravating to realize that that's largely the case. I mean, think about it in terms of let's just switch gears for a second and think about it in terms of history. How do you know that George Washington exists? And you can think, well, I see his picture on the dollar bill. Okay, that's fine. But what if there were people who created George Washington as a hoax and convinced enough people that he existed that they put his face on the dollar bill? How do you go back and you check the historical sources to see that he actually existed? I mean, do you know for certain that there was a deed that was listed in, say, I guess it was the Virginia Register, saying that Monticello belonged to, oh wait, it was Mount Vernon, belonged to George Washington? Have you ever seen that deed for yourself? Have you ever seen anything that had George Washington's signature on it for yourself? And do you know for a fact that that was an authentic document and not something that was forged? You could just do kind of a turtles all the way down kind of thing until you realize, I have no real certainty. I just know that so many people believe it, and so many people have told me that it's true, and it's everywhere throughout our society that I have no real reason to doubt it. But that's not really the same thing as certainty because, look at religion. There are people who today, don't believe that Jesus Christ actually existed, that he was a fictional person. And yet, you have churches built in his name everywhere. You have, people wearing crosses, which is the cross being the instrument of his death, which would never have happened if he were, actually a fictional person. Um, there are people who actually suspend that kind of belief and say, well, maybe he wasn't. Maybe these apostles just made up somebody, and then that story carried through until enough people believed it that now we have all of these churches around the area, and a lot of Mexican families name their kids Jesus. So what kind of certainty can you actually have? You can't create a time machine and go back to Nazareth and -3, -4 BC and see if some family from Bethlehem show up and hang out in Egypt for a while and then go back up and maybe there'll be a slaughter of children like happens at the beginning of the Gospel of Matthew. You can't do any of that. You can't do any of that. So what do you do? I mean, eventually what it comes down to is you start asking yourself the question, do I trust the sources who are telling me these things? And that's not an issue of certainty anymore. Then it becomes an issue of credibility. And the same thing happens in the realm of science. You get these scientific journals, you get these scientific reports, you get these news articles, or maybe you pick up a book and it's written by a scientist, or maybe it's written by somebody who's reported on science, and you have to ask yourself, do I find the source credible enough that I can take this as true, even though I have no way of personally verifying that myself. I have no way of going from credibility to certainty. And, for me, I haven't really done a whole lot of scientific exploration into any particular topics, except one in particular. I did a very, very deep dive into the subject of evolution because when I was a Christian, of course, evolution is a major question. It is a major challenge to the Christian model because the Bible talks of a special creation of man, and says, God created man in the image of God. None of the animals were created in the image of God. There was a special creation of man, and therefore the idea that man somehow evolved from a prior primate life form is just like, wait, that doesn't fit. And for a while, I had just set that issue aside because even though I was intelligent enough to go, looking for that kind of information, trying to educate myself and figure out, okay, what's true and what's not true, I said, I don't want to deal with that right now. And so got into Christianity, and then it was, several years later that I said, okay, well, it's time to tackle the creation versus evolution question and see, what is true. So I wound up getting a whole bunch of different books and reading for myself from these books. And of course, I'm not really addressing the problem of, well, how do I know that these people aren't lying to me? How do I know that, I could actually trust the information that they're giving me? How do I know they're not wrong about the information that they're giving me? But setting all that aside, I finally came around and read enough books to say, okay, based on everything I've read, I've determined that human evolution is a real thing. And it is not the case that humanity was specially created, but rather humanity is the product of evolution. But, despite the kind of certainty that I had come to at that point, I still had a question. Because, once I had reached a level of enough evidence to prove to myself that human evolution was true, I had to wonder about the objections of other people who were geneticists saying that it wasn't true. And so I remember I emailed a geneticist at a website called Reasons to Believe. I think they're rtb.org, but I haven't looked it up, so you'll have to look it up. It was founded by a guy named Hugh Ross, and he's been on the Dennis Prager show a few times. And I basically found a guy in Reasons to Believe who was well versed in genetic science. And I said, here's what I've read in this book by another geneticist that says, here's how we know that human evolution is true. And I sent off that email to him. Now, he did respond to me. And he said, well, the kind of genetic stuff that you're seeing there could have also been produced this way. I thought, okay. I had no idea what he was talking about. I mean, the science was above my head at that point. But I also had the email of the guy who had written the book. So I sent that email over to the guy who had written the book and said, this is what I sent to a guy who still believes in special creation, and here's what he said. Do you have a response to this? And the guy sent me a response back saying, yeah, the genetic process that he's talking about doesn't work that way. And I'm like, okay, so now here is this process that I know nothing about. One guy's saying this is how this could possibly be. The other guy's saying, no, it can't possibly work like that. And I don't have the wherewithal to dive into the process myself and try and figure out, okay, which of these two scientists is right about this. So I finally had to just bank on an issue of credibility. It's like, okay, of these two people, who has the most chance of being the unbiased source who is trying to present a point of view that supports himself? Well, of course, you've got the natural biases of the guy who is the creationist, because he is wanting to prove the veracity of the Bible, being a Christian, and he is wanting to support his organization that he belongs to, Reasons to Believe, And so he's going to say, that, oh, well, there's alternate explanations for that kind of genetic thing. But here's the thing, the guy on the other side, the guy who had written the book, was himself a Mormon, and Mormons also respect the Bible. And you would think that a person who respects the Bible is going to want to take the special creation side as well. And if he doesn't, then you have some credibility on that side because he's got competing interests and he's going with what he honestly believes is true. And I saw the same thing with another book that was distributed. It was called The Language of God, and it's by Francis Collins. Francis Collins he was at one point the head of the Human Genome Project, and while serving as the head of the Human Genome Project, he was also an evangelical Christian, or at least a Protestant Christian. I don't know about evangelical, but a Christian, a Bible-believing Christian. But Francis Collins wrote this book, The Language of God, trying to form a synthesis between creation and evolution because he holds to evolution. And so he, being the head of the Human Genome Project, having access to all of the human DNA that would be able to prove, if there was such proof to be offered, that special creation is actually how humans got here rather than evolution, then he nevertheless is publishing a book about evolution and trying to synthesize that with the creation story. And not only that, he's actually created an organization called BioLogos, which tries to put out videos to reconcile science and creationism, and they do it in I would say they use some kind of underhanded tactics to do it. For one thing, they use the term evolutionary creationism, which is just evolution. I mean, the only reason that they say evolutionary creationism is that that by including the name creationism, they try and open the door to getting creationist Christians to listen to their arguments. And I think that's really backhanded. I also saw another video that they did one time where they were basically explaining the 7 days of creation in terms of science, except they went and they reordered some of the days of creation in order to make it compatible with science, and didn't say anything about that. So I think BioLogos is kind of a sketchy organization. They mean well, but I don't think their tactics are all above board. But again, this is a guy who his personal religious beliefs would more naturally bias him toward trying to prove the Bible correct rather than trying to prove evolution correct. And he has all this data at his disposal, and nevertheless, he says, evolution is what's true. And that was something that I came to realize about almost every scientist that I encountered. There were none, that ever got convinced of the truth of creationism by science. I had only ever seen Christians who were convinced out of evolution. Christians who had been convinced out of creationism by science to believe in evolution. And in one particular case, I saw a scientist who had been convinced out of evolution by the Bible into creationism. But I had never once encountered any Christian who had been convinced out of evolution into creationism by science. It was always one way. All of the scientific convincing went from creation to evolution, and all of the convincing from evolution to creationism was through the Bible. And so, looking at that, I just said, okay, I kind of see which way the wind was blowing here. And there was no sense in denying the truth of evolution from that point forward. But all of that was not really certainty-based. All of that was credibility-based. There was never really a time when I could say, okay, except for the one time when I was reading the one book and saying, okay, I've seen enough evidence now, and now I understand that human evolution is really a true thing. I still feel like there was some measure of certainty in that, even though I still have to believe that the guy who wrote the book is telling me the truth and that he interpreted his results correctly and that everything that he saw had been reported to him accurately, etc., etc., etc. So even then, there's a credibility thing. And it's all really credibility. And we take that credibility and we use that all the way throughout life, not just in science, but really in every area of our lives. Why do we go to a tax accountant instead of doing our own taxes necessarily? We go to H&R Block and we think, well, because they are part of this long-standing organization, then we can trust them to do our taxes correctly. You don't know that for a fact, and who knows, they may be costing you money if you don't double check the numbers yourself, but you give them that sort of credibility. I need to find a tax accountant myself just to ask some questions to, and I'm looking around and thinking, yeah, well, I have no idea who's credible and who's not. I have a form that's from a tax accountant that I think I went and visited 7 or 8 years ago, and I'll probably go back to the same one just because there's the credibility of, well, at least this person didn't steer me wrong that last time. So it's really kind of aggravating when you realize that there is so little certainty that you can actually experience other than what you objectively perceive yourself. And then, even then, your objective perceptions are so subject to subjectivity. I'm not trying to be a punster here, but that's just the case. Sometimes you will see things and you didn't really see them. Sometimes you will hear things and you didn't really hear them. I remember one time I was reading a verse in the Bible, and I read something, and it was so profound that I had to sit back and just be like, whoa, that is some profound stuff. I need to sit on that. I need to meditate on that. And I, just for 5 minutes, I was just kind of thinking about it and ruminating on it. And then I was, done meditating on it, and then I went back to look at it, and it turns out the verse had said exactly the opposite of what I thought it said. I don't know how to explain that. I mean, I thought I saw the word not, but the word not was not there. So, sometimes you can't even believe the evidence of your own senses. So, credibility is really how we determine so much in life, and you've got to be cautious about to whom you give that credibility, the people you rank with that credibility to actually tell you what's what. I think one of the things that we've seen over the last 4 years has been a destruction, an absolute laying waste of media credibility, which is kind of chilling because when you don't have trusted news sources to tell you what's what, how in the world are you going to make sense of the world, for one thing, and decide to plan how to manage your life in the world when you just can't even trust what's going on? We've had so many hoaxes. The Fine People hoax would be one of those hoaxes. Another one of the hoaxes would be the drink bleach hoax, which was then countered with the rebuttal of the UV light hoax. And when you realize, and some of these things are being proffered by people who you would otherwise consider credible. And I guess all I'm trying to say is we live in really, really uncertain times. And I think it's also partly because of the uncertainty and not knowing how to trust and not wanting you to just put any kind of blind trust in me. Is like, for example, in my religious series, I call it "Don't Take This as Gospel," and I mean that. Don't take this as gospel is just basically giving you various ideas and thoughts, and not telling you to accept them as 100%, absolute certainty, because you just can't have that. You can't have that certainty. Look at what we're dealing with now with the election. There are people who are saying, "Oh, I'm absolutely certain that there was no voter fraud that swayed the election in favor of Joe Biden." And then there are people on the other side who are saying, "Oh, I'm absolutely certain that there was voter fraud swaying the election in favor of Joe Biden." Who do you believe? Where do you get your evidence from? And are those sources biased? You have to look at these things. And you have to be able to live without certainty, because the things you can be absolutely certain about, you can really probably count on one hand. So, take everything with a grain of salt. Start from a position of non-trust and work your way up from there. Make your sources prove themselves. One of the things Scott Adams says is your sources should be able to make predictions, and those predictions should be accurate. When you've got a source like that, latch onto it. But again, remember, those sources can always be wrong too. You'll never have certainty. Sometimes credibility is the best you can do. I'm Mike Partika. Thank you for listening. If you want to get notified of the next video, please do subscribe. And other than that, I will talk to you later.